My full name is Celeste Patricia Dixon. I currently live in Frederick, Maryland, in the county, not the city. And I am an office manager for a nonprofit. It's actually a religious community, the Baha'i National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, their Washington office.
Excellent, thank you. And were you born in Carroll County?
Actually, I was born in Montgomery County, but my parents at that time were residents in the Sykesville area of Carroll County.
But what was the situation of the hospital situation in Carroll County, or what was the proximity of the nearest hospital that you were born in?
Well, at that time, there weren't a lot of choices for people of color. And the nearest hospital to the Sykesville area at that time, and we're talking 1949, was Montgomery General Hospital in Albany, Maryland, or the long trek to Baltimore City, the University of Maryland downtown, or another stretch would be in Pennsylvania. I don't recall which would be the closest hospital at that point, but Montgomery General, the old Montgomery General Hospital in Albany was the choice.
So in Carroll County itself, there was no hospital that was available for your family?
No, there was not.
And how did your family come to live in Carroll County?
Well, actually, my paternal grandparents, this was their original home from several generations going back. And this was my father's family, and several of his siblings still reside in this county. And that's why we were here.
And you lived in Carroll County, you now live in Frederick. How long did you live in Carroll County, and during what period of your life?
We're talking my early childhood to late childhood years, between the ages of 5 and 11. Because it was the 5th grade when we actually moved out of the county into northern Arundel County when my parents bought property for a home there.
Can you tell us a little bit about your grandfather and your father and your siblings and what they were doing at the time when you were growing up?
Well, my father actually was working from earliest memory. He actually worked for Fort George G. Meade in their audiovisual department, which was quite a long commute in those days from Westminster all the way down to that particular fort in what is now Anne Arundel County. And that was his area of specialty. And I'm not sure if he was actually trained by his father, my grandfather, Thomas A. Dixon Sr., or not in that, but my grandfather also was a projectionist. And I think it was a part-time job for him at the time that he evolved into from having been a piano player for silent movies. And I understand he was quite a good one. I heard him play a little bit, but I never saw him do it with a movie.
And there are no recordings of those times?
There are no recordings that anyone has ever found, to my knowledge.
And where did he get his musical training?
You know, I never really was clear on that. Those are questions you ask a grandparent and some of the relatives. He used to play in a band when he was a young man. I don't remember where he said he learned to play piano, but he was very good and was very natural for it.
Excellent. And your father was involved in this commute to Fort Meade at that time?
Yes, this was the career he had chosen after coming back from World War II.
And was there a time between the end of the war and the Fort Meade employment that he worked in Carroll County? Was he involved in activities here and making a living
Not
here?
that I'm aware of. Not employment. There wasn't a lot of employment in Carroll County, at least not in the areas where he had an interest. And I'd only known about his projectionist or, sound work that he may have gotten when he was part of which was in the military. I don't know for sure. It was not really clear. But for the years when I was growing up, he always had projection work, and that's where his interest was. Although from around 5, there was, I'm not sure it was a whole year we were in the Annapolis area, and he had for a short time worked at a cement pipe plant. But I don't know what the years were on that. It wasn't a long period of time.
And you mentioned that he was a projectionist part-time. Was he involved in other activities as well?
Well, my grandfather was a projectionist part-time. He was also custodian at the main library here in Westminster.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather was, yeah. My dad didn't do any of that work. His work was, as I'd known, had been at Fort Meade.
I see. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience, your school life when you were here during the period between 5 and 11. Where did you go to school at the time?
I went to Robert Moton School, and it was the only black school, from my understanding, first grade through 12th grade. Some of my relatives tell me that it didn't always go that far, but that was the only education facility available to the county, to all over the county. So children were bussed in and walked in from wherever they lived, and if you could get there, that's where you went to school. Both of my parents are graduates of that school.
And did you live near the school, or did you have to also bus in or commute
Well,
in some
we
way?
were fortunate. We lived on the western edge of Westminster at the time, which I don't think was inside the actual city limits at that point in time, because we're still talking about a period of segregation. And but we were able to walk. I think we were no more than about a quarter, if about between an eighth and a quarter of a mile away from the school, so we always could walk.
And what memories do you have of your school experience at that time?
Actually, very pleasant ones. It was definitely something that, thanks to the books my grandfather brought home from the library, you know, just spurred my thirst for knowledge. I loved to learn. I was a talkative student, so from time to time I was admonished by my instructors about when it was appropriate to speak in class. But I always had a lot of questions and a lot of information I wanted to share. And they were good experiences. They were good. The teachers were wonderful. They were firm. They guided you, and they just inspired you to want to learn. At least the ones I had, I felt did. And I had very good friends.
Well, if your grandfather acquired books from the library, obviously he was also transmitting this thirst or this hunger for learning, huh?
Yeah, he recognized that, you know, what he needed to do to nurture it. He did that for several of his grandchildren, his own children. So, you know, being a musician himself, I guess by trade and art in his younger years, and not so much as he got older, he also had, one of my uncles had his own band in high school, and he helped to fund that to make sure that they had that as an ongoing business. And my uncle did study, you know, he graduated high school, went on to Morgan State University, and, you know, well beyond that. So, yeah, he knew how to nurture and inspire those of us who needed it, and those who appreciated it took that and ran with it. And those who didn't, well, they did what they wanted to do.
Did you have a favorite teacher at Moton? What can you say about the faculty and their influence on your life?
I wouldn't say I had a favorite. I mean, I had, you know, you'd had an all for them. You know, you had a very strong respect for them because they didn't put up with any foolishness. You were there to learn. That was what they were there to do, is to teach you, to guide you. And they reinforced the moral values hopefully you were learning at home. So, you know, if there was a problem at school, then you dreaded the note going home to your parents because you knew it was in store for you when that note got there, and somehow it just seemed to get there ahead of you. I don't know how that was, but it did. You know, telepathy maybe, I don't know, but you just didn't want to get in trouble.
Now, you mentioned that this was a segregated school, and segregation was the effects of that influenced your life. Were there any opportunities or exposure that you had to integrate or to be exposed and more engaged with the white population of Carroll County?
Well, there wasn't, from my own recollection, I didn't see beyond the day-to-day, there wasn't a lot of that available to us, simply because you had to know your place, whatever that really meant, which meant that you were restricted in your movement. You didn't have the same, say, if you went to the theater, and I was a lot older before I actually went to a movie theater, sat down inside and enjoyed one, because we had to go to the balconies and you went in through a side or back door. You didn't go through the main front door like you can now. And that used to bother me as to, well, why was that? We're all people, and you're all paying the same money in the same currency, and this is the United States of America. And I used to hear people talk about the Civil War, and we won the right to do this, and yet it seemed like nothing really changed. So why was it like that? I would ask questions like that at 6 and 7, and people would try their best to explain how it was the law, but it just never settled well in my psyche. You know, in my soul, it didn't feel right. if we fought a war to eradicate this, how was it legally okay to do it? So there weren't a lot of times when, you could go to games, you could go to a shop, you could go to this place or that, but you found that you had different lines, different doors. You didn't even go to the same churches and sit with the people and you're praying to the same God, which I really thought was the most baffling of all of this. My grandparents also, as one of their part-time jobs, cleaned the Presbyterian church near what is now McDaniels College. And we used to, my and my younger sister sometimes would go along with them to help with the dusting and the mopping. And we weren't allowed to even sit in sanctuary and pray with them. But my grandfather also used to ring the bell in that church every Sunday morning before he attended his own church. But again, we couldn't go and worship with them. And I couldn't understand how you could be praying to the same God, but you weren't welcomed in a house of worship to the same God. And that bothered me a lot, and I often had questions about that.
At what point, if ever, did some of that change when you saw a transition to a softening of the lines between the races, if indeed that occurred?
Well, my first real experience of that around 6 and 7 and 8 was the if you remember the black and white movies of the Our Gang series, that was my first experience of actually seeing integration, seeing a diverse group of kids just having fun being kids. And not only did it address the race issue, but it also addressed the socioeconomic class issue. These were children who were middle class, poor, and well-to-do. They were playmates. And they just showed them having life's experience as kids. They were also, several of them, except for the one really well-to-do in a private school, they were all in the same classroom. It was a 1 or 2 room school. I never really remember what the name of the town was. They never went into that kind of detail. It rarely had adults in it. It was about the kids. It was diverse, and I loved it. That was my favorite show. I mean, even the Mickey Mouse Club wasn't integrated. And I loved that show too, but it wasn't. I think I saw one child of color in that program in all the years I watched it.
So that was something you saw on television, but is there anything in your personal life that created an opportunity for you also to experience firsthand that kind of mingling?
Well, yes, indeed. And I think it's one of the more enduring memories outside of my playtime with my peers and my cousins in our neighborhood was the fact that there was 2 young ladies who were students on what was Western Maryland College at that time, and they started a Brownie Girl Scout troop, but they insisted that it be integrated. And no churches, now under the conference in this state, there were no black churches, I think, that were allowed to host that. It had to be a white church. And they found one church that was, let's say, brave enough, bold enough to take a step forward and open that door. And it was United Methodist Church. I don't remember the specific, other than it was United Methodist Church. And it was on the east side of the city. I think there's a cemetery near that location of that particular church. The minister, whose name has long since escaped me, and his congregation were bold enough and loving enough, compassionate enough, I should say, to open that door so that children of color could be a part of that troop. In fact, to this day, that's the one endearing thing from my childhood that I really remember about the first steps of integration in this county was that troop. Now, we weren't allowed to go everywhere with our white counterparts. So there were things maybe they had participated in that we were barred from. We couldn't, though the 3 or 4 of us who were black couldn't go with them. But these young ladies tried to make sure that there wasn't anything we did in service projects or just where we went that we couldn't all be there. They insisted on that. I mean, even though there were times they took us to the college for projects on the outer lawn of the campus, we couldn't even go into the buildings to use the restrooms. So they would take us all to where we could use a restroom discreetly, even though we may have had to do it individually. Unfortunately, I don't remember their names. I don't have anything with their names on it.
But when there were scout activities, how did you feel when there would be planned events and you would be excluded?
Well, I just felt it made me angry. It made me angry. The virtues and leadership and leadership strengths that were taught, which the Girl Scouts of America stood for, were important and open, and I just felt we weren't living up to those. And it just seemed so unfair and so unjust that you would put this upon anybody, especially children. What is it that you want us to learn? It seemed to go against those ideals, all of them.
Did your parents have any comments about that situation, that experience that you had? Did they have observations, or were they also distraught or angry about that situation, or was it something that they took as what had been customary? How did they react?
They actually took it as what had been customary. They tried to soften it as much as they could, the parents and grandparents. There wasn't a lot of commentary about it other than this is the way it is. It may not always be this way, but right now this is the way it is, and we just have to deal with that.
And what happened after you left Carroll County at 11 years old and moved to another place? How do you characterize your next destination and the kinds of experiences you had there as compared to Carroll County?
Well, we moved to northern Arundel County. My parents had been blessed with the ability to buy property and to be able to build a home there. That put my father much closer to his job instead of a near 2-hour commute he had for about 10 to 11 years from Westminster to Fort Meade. This put him within 25, 30 minutes of a job, which was a good thing. It gave him back more family time with us. Also, that was the year 1960, thereabouts, was when they abolished the segregation laws in this state. And so when I was finishing the 6th grade, and the 6th grade was my last year being in an all-black school. So at the beginning of 7th grade, junior high, I had the option to go to an integrated school. And that for me was a great opening of the doors. I thank God for that, for having moved, even though I missed my beloved hills of Carroll County. But this opened a new doorway of opportunity for me, because then I could go to a junior high and high school that was integrated with children from all over the world, because I was going to school with the military kids. These were Army children who had lived all over the world in different forts. Some of their parents were from different cultures and countries. And this was everything I'd read about in National Geographic and in the encyclopedias that my grandfather had brought home, the old ones he'd brought home from the library, was open to me now. And that, to me, was the greatest gift I could have had.
Well, I can tell by the smile on your face that it was an opening and an exposure that was welcomed and overdue, for sure.
Oh yeah. We, in fact, just last summer in August, I attended my 40th high school reunion. I had not attended any of them before because they're military kids. It's very difficult to find a lot of them. There was over 400 of us in our graduating class, but you can barely find a third of them now. But the ones of us who were there, it was really a great coming together. It really was. The diversity was really a wonderful thing. It really is. If you want people to live like in unity, if you want people to live like your brother's keeper, as we were always taught, then you have to be able to be around everybody to see that they were more alike than not. We had the same kinds of interests, the same kinds of fears, the same kind of concerns as parents, the same kind of fun and craziness. It was all there. And it was just great.
Apart from the class reunion, have you maintained friendships with some of your classmates from that period, separately from the group reunion?
I didn't always have as much contact with them because people were all of our lives have been just so busy in different arenas. The few that I did have, I would be able to email or phone call every now and then, and if we could get our calendars to match up, the most we might be able to do sometimes is just have a phone call, but maybe not physically get together. So there are 4 or 5 I've been able to keep up with. Some of them are already deceased, though, out of that group. Yeah.
So after all of that exposure and those new experiences and the diversity of people that you had contact with in junior and high school, what reflections do you have about Carroll County as in contrast to that new awakening, let's say?
Well, we always came back up to visit for family gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas time. as long as my grandparents were living, and even beyond, with reunions with the family. And I would see, what I would notice about the kids I remembered from my elementary school days here was the ones who had gone off to college and maybe expanded beyond the boundaries of Carroll County, and the ones who hadn't, and who had done something substantive with their lives, or those who I felt had sort of remained sort of trapped within the boundaries of where they were. And I always felt that, and I used to tell a few of them every now and then, I said, you know, it's worth it to get out of your own backyard and see what the rest of the world is doing, what it looks like. You might find something you like. And you can always come back, because you know where home is. But you need to at least see what's outside that fence.
So besides family and living in Carroll County, when you'd come back, what else about the county is so attractive to you that you missed in all of your other travels beyond the county?
Well, they've done a lot more development up here. And although I do miss some of the farms that I see a lot fewer of, there are still plenty of them left. It's gotten more diverse in, economically, even though a majority of the people may commute out of the county for their jobs. So I see a lot more population, a lot more of these little shops, more diversity of gender, as well as population of professional people, not just the farmers.
So do you have opportunity you still have family in Carroll County? And
I do.
So you have opportunity to come back?
And visit, yes.
And visit. Yeah.
They family and friends. Just some of the old neighbors are still there. Their families are still there. Yeah, so we still are all very much in touch with each other.
Would you like to, this is your opportunity to comment on whatever you would like with regard to your experience in relation to Carroll County and as the so-called Black experience in Carroll County.
I think that this is a wonderful project. I think wherever these projects take place is always significant in completing the history. There's a lot of people on both sides of the fence who don't really know what the whole history is. They know bits and pieces of how people's lives were impacted or tormented or undermined or overwhelmed, any and all those categories. And I think for people to heal and for us to be able to move beyond it, it's important to be clear and factual on what really happened to a lot of people around you, what was really going on and why. And that, I think that just clears the fog, really clears the fog. I think it's important. And it's important because our children need to know, everybody's children in this county need to know where they came from and what our potential is of where we can go with it.
So, starting with the own personal individual experience and how your living in the county affected you personally and either constrained or provided opportunities were all formative influences on how you perceived your living in the county and gave you a base for appreciating what you found later in life outside Carroll County.
It did indeed. It was all about that question of justice. One might think that a child of 5 and 6 wouldn't understand or have any concerns about it, but when you have a sense that things didn't feel right, how people treated each other, and for me it became a crusade for justice. So
and that seed was planted early on in your life? Early on,
just by the question of separate churches, separate doorways. I mean, everybody has to go to the grocery store, everyone has to use restrooms, everybody needs a drink of water, but the water doesn't differentiate between who it goes to. And the Bible lessons I had learned in church, and it was the United Methodist Church on Union Street, said that all comes from God. There's no distinguishing that. So it just didn't make sense to me why there was a distinction in where I was living. So it all became a crusade for justice to answer those questions.
Now, at the time, were there actual signs for black and white, or was there
There
a
were.
tacit understanding of what the limitations were?
There were both. Maybe not everything was labeled, but many things were very clearly labeled colored and white. Very clearly. Maryland is still a southern state. It's a border state, but it's a southern state. Even though the Deep South may not consider us very southern, and that's okay. Everyone has their own opinion.
Well, Ms. Dixon, thank you very much for sharing with us your experience and your views. We look forward to talking to you again as this project evolves.
Thank you for having me.